Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Founders Playbook from Lab to Launch. Lessons from startups in a world where capital is constrained. Because let's be honest, the typical startup device doesn't work for deep tech founders. You can't just move fast and break things. When your product has been developed over a decade of peer-reviewed research, you can't just follow the Silicon Valley playbook when you're navigating intellectual property and trying to find capital for hard tech in a capital-constrained world. So where do you get the real answers? You get them from someone who's actually done it. Our guest today is Henry Dunne, founder of Microneedle Solutions, MNS. Today, Henry's opening up his playbook. No jargon, no fluff, just the unfiltered truth about the mistakes made, the lessons learned, and the strategies that actually work. So, if you're an academic, think you're making the leap, this is the conversation you've been waiting for. So, Henry, welcome to the Founders Playbook. Good to see you.
Thank you. It's good to see you too.
Henry, imagine you're explaining your company to an intelligent investor who isn't an expert in your field. In simple terms, what is the major problem that you solve?
We're all about solving the issue of needles. So needles, they're painful, they're invasive, they're logistically challenging, and they're ultimately resource intensive. And so they require someone, highly trained medical personnel to administer them. They require cold chain transportation. They require incineration post-use. And so what we're doing is challenging that with our product, which enables a painless alternative and self-administered. And we've done this by designing a completely novel, dissolvable microneedle system. And I think the main issue that we realized was in manufacturing. The ability to, manufacture these at a price point that's equivalent to needles is really key, but also some technical issues with delivery efficiency. And then ultimately what we're really motivated about not only is going to save a lot of money for likes of the NHS and healthcare providers, but it can ultimately help to save lives in low to middle income countries and reduce health inequalities across the globe.
Fantastic, yes, because it's easier to transport, easier to move. And frankly, look, anybody that is telling me that actually, Neil, from now on, nobody's going to have to put a needle in your arm, it's going to be my friend.
Yeah.
Interesting you were saying the key problem there you had to solve wasn't the microneedles themselves, but it was the manufacturing. Is that right?
Yes, that is true. And, as you said, and as we kind of realized through our market research, 90% of people would prefer a painless patch to a needle. And so when you frame it like that, it begs the question, why hasn't it not made it to market? And it was through intensive, customer discovery, market research, where we realized that one of the biggest issues was in manufacturing. How can you have a product that is supposed to challenge needles and yet costs 10 times the amount of needles, sometimes even 20 times? And so when you frame it like that, you can start to see that there is a glaring issue with manufacturing. And I think it's a more wider issue, especially in medtech and health tech, in that, companies and founders, you focus on the technical benefits of your technology at a lab scale, and you tend to not really focus on manufacturing until you're much closer to market. And that's what our competitors have done and what other people have done in microneedles. And ultimately, it means that you take a product to market, but there is no market because it's costing too much. And so that's what we're looking at addressing.
That's a really, really crucial point. I think we're going to come back to that later on. But that whole point about understanding the market, not just the tech, is key, isn't it, to being able to create a company that's successful as opposed to just technology.
Certainly, yes.
Before you came to be founder of MNS, what brought you here?
I studied biotechnology with enterprise at the University of Leeds, and I was one of the unlucky ones in the sense that I started university during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I was stuck in my dorm, social distancing. And ultimately, it was that combined with the fact that we had to all go to get those, your jabs for the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was just blatantly obvious the inefficiencies that were there. You had to queue up for ages. You then had to go in, then get a jab, which was ultimately painful and, sometimes nerve-wracking. And I met my co-founder at the University of Leeds as we both studied biotechnology with enterprise. And together, we realized that there's a huge market here. Why has it not made it to market?
Fascinating. So you yourself, in fact, experience the problem. You have an experience of it. We all had an experience of it in 2021, and so from then on, and it was that experience that drove you into trying to solve the problem and into investigating why the problem was.
Exactly. And it was thanks to my degree in biotechnology, so essentially the commercial side of biology. And it was through that, obviously you're scanning the literature, baffled as to why it has not made its market. And I think we also had really great professors who had worked on microneedles as well. And further, made us realize that, okay, yes, there is something here. It is possible to make. And so let's just go for it.
Right. So it's that really good combination of a bit of personal motivation when a nurse walks up to you with a needle, the understanding of the medical side, part of your degree, part of what you were studying, and that support system around you. That means you can pull upon different brains, different pieces of knowledge, different connections that all overlap in the same space. That's really useful.
Yes, definitely. I know as a young founder, you don't know what you don't know. And so you need to be able to tap those resources of those people that have had that experience. And I think that we were extremely lucky in that we had a research group that was already focusing on microneedles at the time. And so being able to speak to them and get market insights was invaluable.
Brilliant stuff. So then, given all that, what was the moment you thought that all this could actually build into something?
I went online, and luckily at the University of Leeds, we have this scholarship called Spark, and they basically give young entrepreneurs resources with regards to, business plan templates, that sort of thing. And so I downloaded the business plan template and I just set about writing the business plan. And it was actually there where the more I got into it, the more I could see there was lots of different opportunities and the more excited I got. And I think that's when it really hit me like, okay, yes, there is something here. And usually what happens if you have the eye into it and then there's lots of different reasons as to why it won't work or there's lots of issues with it. Whereas with the microneedles, it's complete opposite. And business planning is just such a great exercise because it enables you to think about all of the different aspects of the business, from market research, from customer discovery to actually building the product and how you're going to sell it as well. And that is what ultimately made me realize that, okay, yeah, there's something serious here that we can build upon. And it ultimately got me really excited, which I think is a key thing.
Right. So again, that really important piece of support. Here's something you can do. Here's a bit of support from the university. And then finding that opportunity and getting excited and seeing the opportunity, screaming out at you. So you've got to have that mindset, right? You've got that ability to look at something and not see the why not, but also the why you should do something.
Yeah, exactly. And I've always had an entrepreneurial spirit, and so I guess there was that also in the background that was kind of pushing me on and kicking me on. Access to those resources at university, we wouldn't be able to do it because this was all pre-AI and everything. So it wasn't like we could just go online and, that access to the support. But it's not just with the business planning, it's about how do you actually start a business? How do you go about interviewing the right people? And I think another thing that was really great from the university was the fact that they had previous alumni who had been there and done that. And so they could literally tell you, signpost you to some of the pitfalls that you're likely to come into and try and mitigate that. And that's super valuable because especially as a first time entrepreneur in a very tricky industry in the sense that, it's deep tech and it's life science, there's so many regulations, having that, that someone who's been there and done that is really invaluable. And that also, thanks to Spark, helped us out a lot.
So that's interesting because it makes me ask, who do you think was the first person you spoke to that really gave you that support and even that example to follow?
I would say that if we were to split that into the first believer of the science and then the first believer of actually the product in use. And so the first believer of the science was our professor who ultimately became our scientific advisor. And I remember so distinctly, it was ages ago, we had a meeting with them and we were just talking about microneedles and they were just saying how, it's amazing technology. And to hear that from someone who literally went on the BBC, did interviews as to why COVID-19 vaccines work. So someone who's really respected in the field was such motivation and gave us such confidence that there is something here within this technology. And then when we look at the commercial side, it was actually speaking to a clinician. And so I managed to get in contact with a clinician through one of my uncles. And I told them about this and they were how much it could save time, how much it would benefit them, especially for neurodiverse individuals, not having to worry about needle stick injuries, even just, the amount of waste that actually goes on during vaccine administration. There's all sort of things that I had no idea about, which they, basically identified further USPs. Because I think a common issue or common thing that investors and people in general say about health tech is that you think you build a product that you think people like. But actually, when you speak to the clinicians, they don't want to use it. And so by the fact that we were able to get that feedback from clinicians was just super useful. And ultimately, it was inspiring for us.
Fantastic. So thinking about all that interest, all that validation, when you're talking to different people and saying, look, this really is a problem, right? I don't know how you're going to solve it, but this really is a problem, that problem validation piece that's so important. What was the tipping point that made you decide to say, look, I'm not going to go for the relative safety of normal work. I'm going to make a company out of this. I'm going to become an entrepreneur. What would you do that?
Yeah, I think one of the main tipping point was that I was introduced to an alumni who was the CEO of a previous biotech company and eventually sold it to Merck. And so he had been there and done that. And it was speaking to him about it and his excitement and his, his support in the sense that he was telling me, you should be doing this. This is exactly what people want. With regards, this is exactly what young people should be doing. To hear that from someone that's actually been there and done that in a field that was exactly the same as mine, it just gave me that confidence.
Fantastic. Yeah, and if you can see it, then you can be it. It's always what people say. Okay, so there you are. You've come out of university that's been supportive. You've done the research yourself. You've seen the problem. You've spoken to the people. You've got validation of the problem, and you can see that other people have done it and that they're supporting you and advising you. There's an ecosystem building around you that you have built. Hard tech is called hard for a reason. Now, you're talking about manufacturing processes that haven't been cracked in something like 20 years. What was the biggest technical hurdle you had to overcome to prove this was a viable product and not just a science project?
Yeah, well, you said it, manufacturing is just so hard. And people underestimate how hard it was because we realized, very early on that manufacturing was a key issue. And so when we designed the product, we designed a novel product, but then we had to design a novel manufacturing on top of that. And it took us a whole year. We were planning to get it done in Q2, ended up being done in Q4, delay. And I think one of the things, you manage to do something like, so you have an issue and you manage to solve that. Then upon solving that issue, there's like 5 more issues that arise. And then you've got to go and solve them. And it can be very, very challenging, long days, long hours. And it can be very demoralizing as well, because you can work for, 9 months on this manufacturing system and for you still not to be able to make microneedle patches. As a team, that was very demoralizing. I think it was Steve Jobs who said that, when you're in that kind of stage and the fact that you find something new out and then it opens up loads of different question issues, that is the magic. That is what is actually creating something valuable. And so, although at the time it was extremely stressful and challenging, in hindsight, we wouldn't have changed it for the world because it ultimately enabled us to produce the manufacturing system that we have now, which is best in class. And so I'd say that there was a plethora of different challenges with our system, with the microneedles. And so they're very small. And so it's a very, very sensitive system. And like little things like, during the winter, it was less humidity. But then during the summer, it was high humidity. And then that massively threw off our manufacturing. And then we finally realized, it's because of the humidity. And then there was different things like there was temperature that played into even ordering, reagents from different companies, and you ask it to be in lyophilized form and they don't send it in lyophilized form, and then you have to repurchase it. There's lots of challenges. But I think that is what ultimately made us create the system that we have today. And without those challenges, without solving those challenges, we wouldn't have a system that was best in class. And so, I'd say that, without a shadow of a doubt, the hardest technical challenge we've had to face is in our manufacturing.
Yeah. And all those lessons that you're talking about, things like humidity, temperature, supply chain, this is going to happen as you scale. You're going to end up in different countries, and you've already hit it, which I guess that if you get through the pain, it'll mean that your ability to scale later on is much, much faster because you won't hit those issues.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really important point, is that also that's true for regulation as well. So for the regulatory piece, because as I said, the typical kind of way, or the previous companies do it, is that you create a product, you then do all of the testings on it, and it's great. And then you're like, okay. And then what you find is that companies end up getting to the point, they've really developed the product, maybe phase 2 or whatever, close to market, and then they realize that they have to go back and redo their whole clinical trials because they've changed their manufacturing. They have to redo their QM, and you end up shooting yourself in the foot. And so I remember really, really clearly, it was like we were on a consultant, or one of our regulatory team, and they were saying how it's always best to get it sorted, or develop the controls, the regulatory piece as you're developing the manufacturing, so that you're not in a position where you're close to market and then you have to go back and spend a load of money to redo a whole bunch of different things. And I think that comes down to the fact that you have to be able to look at where you want to be, and then work backwards. Because again, with the regulatory, I remember someone came in and gave us a talk about how you're developing a medical device and you say that it does all of this sort of thing. And then when you get it to market, you want to have the same classification as an already existing device, for instance. And so the regulators say to you, well, you've said it can do all of these different things. You say it's a completely different novel device, and yet you want the same classification. And so it's just not a concurrent strategy. And so what you had people going back, having to redo everything. And I think that's something that we've really made sure to address from the outset, is our manufacturing regulatory. So making sure that we're, designing manufacturing that's inherently scalable, but also making sure that the regulatory piece is also there so that it's as seamless as possible as we do.
It's interesting because particularly with medical devices and medtech, there is a massive amount of regulatory work you have to go through as well, compared to almost any other innovation. So what was the order of play? Was it iterative? Was it that you started your first prototype with purely a technical thing in mind, or did you start with what do we need to do regulatorily to get this prototype right? How did you balance out the market, technical, and the regulatory influences on what you were prototyping?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to understand the market, and so you have to be able to speak to your customers. And it was through speaking with pharmaceutical companies and obviously experts and key opinion leaders where we realized that there was 2 fundamental issues preventing microneedles from being adopted. So it's the first, manufacturing. But of course, when we're designing our first prototype, we're not focused on manufacturing. We just want to make sure we can design a prototype, right? The second issue was delivery efficiency. So the idea that previous microneedle product deliver inconsistent amount of the drug. And so we went about, okay, let's solve the delivery efficiency problem, because that's a technical one, and that's all about the design of microneedles. We designed our first prototype with, our novel microneedle design. Then the next step was, okay, well, how do we build a manufacturing system that addresses the challenges and can make these patches? Concurrently, you have to also think about the regulatory piece. The way that we kind of went about it was that we just split it up into key phases of growth. So like the preclinical phase, the clinical phase, and then like the safety phase, or the first in human, and then the efficacy phase. So during the preclinical phase, we just focused on, let's just sort out the preclinical regulatory landscape. Let's make sure everything's aligned. Let's get that sorted. And then once we get all of that sorted, we then look to get all of the first in human regulatory stuff sorted. And as you said, you have to be cognizant and aware that there are very stringent regulatory guidelines, especially in health tech. And so you have to have a strategy of product development that incorporates that sort of information. And I think, utilizing consultants and doing that from the earlier stages is very important. But, I'm not saying that you come up with a regulatory strategy, design this manufacturing system before you've made a prototype, because of course you need to make sure that the patches actually work. But once you do that, then it's just simply a case of just addressing the issues or the future challenges that you want as early as possible. You don't want to stick your head in the sand and just act like, later on you're going to be able to sort it all. You have to be able to be proactive.
So you've got to understand the market, and you've got to solve the technical challenge first, because you don't know what you're putting through regulation. Otherwise it doesn't work. But you've got to face it head on and deal with it as you go through, because as you say, in the medtech space, there's a lot of it. It's very important, and you need to get through it. So, and we're all very grateful at the other end that you do.
Yeah.
So really interesting. So before I dive into that market piece, one more thing. Intellectual property. So here you are talking to the market, designing technical solutions with other people, talking to the regulator. But yet the IP is critical for high-tech business. If you don't have ownership or licensing of your IP, you won't get invested in. What was your IP strategy? Did you patent? Have you used another approach? And what was the process like?
For us, IP is our bread and butter because we're ultimately utilizing lots of different business models, but it's going to be heavily depending on licensing. And so that means that we need to have IP that we own, that is, that is substantial and it protects the product itself. As we made the first prototype, and as soon as we made our first prototype, we looked at some patents and IP protected. And we were only able to do that thanks to a grant that we managed to get from the University of Leeds Spark Scholarship. It was a small grant, but it allowed us. At that time, we made like a couple of microneedles. We had the microneedle plan. We managed to get some funding, make a full microneedle patch, and off the back of that, that's what we then enabled us to file our first product and method patents. We managed to get five patents granted, and now the way we went about it was, first of all, understanding what IP is the strongest IP. So obviously, there's different types of intellectual property, and we found that product patents are the strongest. And so we went about, okay, let's just focus on product patent. Let's focus on getting some of the key characteristics of our product protected. Because once we get that, protected, and that can be our cornerstone patent, we can then file that in different jurisdictions and then further ring fence it with divisional applications. And I think what we really try to do is almost create a Venn diagram of protection around our product, with our product in the middle and these different larger scopes of invention, in the sense that we go for a product patent, which is all about physical characteristics. We then go for a chemical composition patent. We then do some, process patents. And ultimately what we're looking to do is just create this web or mesh of IP that fundamentally protects us. And I think that's really, really key. And we were lucky as well because we weren't a spin out. And so all of the IP was owned by us. It was all invented by us. We don't license anything. And so it's crucial for our business, especially if you're looking to do licensing. You need to be able to own the IP yourself, and you need to make sure that the IP is protecting what you're making. And then, the final thing would then be making sure you have it protected in different jurisdictions, because a patent is only useful if there's a commercial, aspect to it. Because if you're only going to get protection in one jurisdiction, then it's not really that useful. And so you have to be able to think about the long-term strategy as well. And I think one of the good things, or good or bad things about IP, is that it's such a long process. So when speaking to investors and stuff like that, it's not like they're looking for granted IP or anything like that. What they're looking to see is that you're have it filed, it's going through the system. Because ultimately, you file a product, it takes like 18 months, then you have to file for PCT, and then it takes another 12 or so months. And so it's a long process. And it's not a case I've only filed IP, and so therefore, I'm not as valuable as someone who's got loads of IP granted. It's very much, that you just have to be in the process, I think. But there's no denying that IP is crucial, especially in deep tech, especially if there's a significant amount of novelty about your innovation.
So there's lots of important stuff coming out there. That whole web and mesh of patents that is much more defensible than just one. Really important. So that whole jurisdictions piece, because otherwise somebody can happily come along and say, oh, look, Henry's got a great idea there, but he's only protected it in the UK. Let's bubble off to another country and let's just do it. Right? Really interesting. So when you were talking to investors about the IP, nobody brought up that, well, you haven't got it yet. They were all just wanted to see that you had that 2-3 year strategy.
Yeah, I think so. And so I think investors, they're professionals, they understand the market. And so they understand that the main thing is that you're in the process, of developing that IP and the IP. I think what they also really keen on looking for is actually, the search and examiner's report. What's the response they've gotten back from the examiner? Like freedom to operate as well. That's a really big thing. Because you can file a patent, but you may not be able to actually utilize that patent because it may infringe on other IP. And I think another key thing that they mentioned or realized was that the brand of who is actually doing your IP as well is quite important. So we used to use a boutique firm. Great, it was obviously a lot cheaper, and they were really great. And they managed to get our first set of IP filed and granted. But we then since moved on to a larger firm essentially. And I think one of the reasons for that is because investors want to see that that you have professionals that know what they're doing, that they've had this experience before, especially the sector, the vertical experience with regards to healthcare, because I think that there's a big difference between someone who doesn't have a healthcare background trying to do some IP versus someone that does, because they understand, common licensing agreements with pharmaceutical companies and how it works. And so I would say that's a really big thing. Just essentially just making sure you have a really coherent strategy, and a strategy that's been validated by multiple different people. So we also employ, so we obviously have a main IP firm that we use, but we also have independent consultants. And I think that's a key thing, because you want to be able to get that mix of opinion. You want an independent opinion as well as, your actual team doing the IP. Because, the last thing we want to do is, file and craft a load of patents and then realize that they're not actually worth anything.
So it's not just what you do, but who does it for you and who does it with you. Again, it's getting that broad advice. Interestingly, you were saying investors want to see somebody that's handling your IP that they think is credible.
Yeah, that was a big thing for us, because I remember we had a board meeting where we were discussing that matter. And I would have on the assumption like we should stick with kind of we've been with, because we have a really good relationship. It was actually our board members that were saying, from an investor perspective, it's better if you were to use, a larger firm, because there's that confidence that they're going to do a job.
Nice.
A good job.
Interesting. So let's talk about the investors for a minute. You weren't at a university creating this thing. There wasn't a spin out process. You didn't have that level of support. So how have you funded your company that thus far? How did you start? And then how did you bridge the gaps between maybe grants, angels, VCs? What was the process? And what were the different levels and opportunities that came your way?
First of all, it's very, very hard when you're starting out, because you don't really have a product, especially in life science, because there's no way you're generating revenue, especially if you're not a spin out. Because obviously when you're a spin out, you have the technology is built on kind of substantial period of time. Whereas when you're a graduate, that's not the case. And so initially we did kind of a friends and family coupled with some crowdfunding. And that's what enabled us to develop our first prototype, actually create a product, do some basic in vitro, so kind of test tube testing, and then file IP. And it was off the back of that, we managed to then do an angel round of funding. And that's what enabled us to fund lab space, do our preclinical testing. One of the great things about the UK is the fact that we have Innovate UK, or we have the Biomedical Catalyst, we have NIHR, we have Royal Academy, we have really great public institutions that give out grant funding to innovative ideas. And I think that's something that we have that not many other countries do have, and they are lifesavers. I know so many companies who wouldn't be around if it wasn't for Innovate funding, and we've been lucky enough to be funded by them twice now. They're funding our first in human clinical trial, huge thing for us. I think one of the issues in the current climate, there's the depth of the VC round below 5 million. So it's quite, relatively, it's quite easy to raise hundreds of thousands, but trying to raise that 1 to 5 million at the moment is being very, very tricky. And I think what's even harder, especially for life science based companies, is that if you're a medical, you need to get your preclinical data and then you can do your first in human. And at the moment, VCs are very, risk averse in the sense that they don't really want to touch preclinical companies because they need to see that clinical validation, which makes sense, obviously. However, then have a big issue because you have a huge funding gap. Clinical trials are not cheap, they're expensive. And so you have to be able to find a way to fund the clinical trials. And I think that's one of the issues currently in the kind of fundraising climate. And one of the ways in which that gap was plugged is obviously through crowdfunding. And so if you're lucky to bridge that gap. But I do think that, especially in the life science sector, right now it is very challenging to bridge that gap from the preclinical to the clinical stage.
Interesting. So, and as we know that because venture capitalists finding it hard to turn cash over, has found it hard for the last couple of years, you've got those funding gaps appearing. And you've got to find ways of reducing the risk, the technical risk, the medical risk, the regulatory risk in your business as much as you can to attract what is a lot less capital available right now, even here in the UK where we're very privileged. So you've used friends and family, you've used grants, you've used angels. It sounds like you're like, where can I get my next cash from? That's where I get it from.
Yeah. And I think what's happening is maybe a couple of years ago, especially in the kind of biotech, you would be able to raise, your preclinical angels, very early stage VCs, and your first in human clinical trials from VCs. But now I think what's happening is because there's not that 1 to 5 million round, which is kind of unique for clinical, first in human or clinical. What's happening is companies moving towards angels. And so what I think is having a kind of a knock-on effect, so that the super earlier stage companies, pre-revenue, pre-products, are finding it really hard to raise angel money. And that's because the C stage companies who were once, really attractive to VCs are now having to go for the angel money. A year ago, people were saying how in the UK, one of the really great things is that there's so much pre-seed and seed funding, like really loads of funding, but then there's no growth capital. And I feel like there's almost been maybe a flip or something, or there's been a shift towards there's now a lot more growth capital available, 5 million plus. There's that middle ground, which seems to be a bit bare. And I think to use in the biotech, and I'm as well listening to somebody speak, and they were saying how there's, barely any biotech VCs now touching preclinical companies, which obviously doesn't bode well. But luckily for being biotech and life science, there's so many more grant opportunities available. So I think that's kind of the strategy is very much you have to utilize grant funding, but also alternative sources of funding. And actually on that, what we've seen recently a lot is crowdfunding. So there's a lot more crowdfunding sites, and it seems to be working a lot more. And the idea of kind of democratization, the idea that, given access to individuals to invest in really highly innovative companies that they wouldn't once have access to, I think it's a really interesting route because it's working. And a lot of companies have been funded by that mode.
Cash is also a market, isn't it? So if there's a shortage in one space, somebody else will fill the gap, and they'll just charge you whatever they charge you for it. And it's never going to be Goldilocks. It's never going to be perfectly smooth all the way up. There's always going to be one part of it that's doing very, very well, and it's quite easy, and another bit that isn't doing so well and is struggling. And this will change over time.
Yeah.
And to that point, it can be a long journey, right? Finding funding. So how are you finding the process, and how are you dealing with the knockbacks?
I think the key thing is, as you said, because it's so hard and because it is a long process, you just have to be pragmatic and you have to have a prudent approach to how you go about fundraising. Because, you can't hope that, throw something at the wall and see what sticks. That just does not work. So you need to find a list of investors, you need to work out here's warm introductions and kind of go through that. But you need to be in constant contact as well. So you need to be able to keep people updated, because otherwise, how are they going to know about what you're doing? And if you get rejected from a VC, don't take what they say, take it as gospel. But in the same breath, don't take raising money as validation of your product, because a lot of the time, or validation of the business, because a lot of the time it can be that, you just hit, the right time, the right place, or it could be that you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You just can't raise money, even though you have a really good. It can be soul crushing. You try to raise money for your business, the runway's dwindling, and you're just not really getting any traction. But I think the key thing is that you just have to remember to yourself, that if you have a product that you believe is going to change the world, and you have a strategy that is prudent, then eventually you'll get the money. And I think another thing is that I remember, you LinkedIn and you see loads of these articles of these companies raising, tens of millions and all of that sort of thing. And you think that you're not doing well because you see those sort of companies raising money. But I think they are the exception. And most of the times it's because, they have a board member who's, really queued up, or they're, a serial entrepreneur that's, exited, for billions, whatever. And so there are the exceptions, and it can be disheartening. But I think that the key things that I was always told is that you just got to keep going. And I think another really important point on that is about identifying the skills gap. So obviously, as a tech-based, founder, or a scientific-based founder, you're queued up with regards to the development of the product and its technical benefits and everything. But you may not have the skill set that's required to raise millions of pounds, and so being able to identify that and then trying to fill that gap, I think is really useful, especially as someone who's a first-time founder, doesn't really have that connection and that network. Bringing someone on board that does, I think, is just invaluable. Give you access to warm introductions, but it also shows to investors and other stakeholders that you can hire better than you. You can hire someone that's, maybe not or better at, has a different sort of skill set. And I think that's also really important.
I think you're right. So hold on, there's lots of stuff going on there. So firstly, um, you will see other people announcing huge raises. There's success bias in that. You hear about them because they have announced a huge raise. Timing really important, as you said. Also, I guess there's something about where they are. A lot of the time you hear people raising in the United States, which is an absolutely unique environment. There was nowhere like it in the world. We're still very privileged compared to the rest of the world in the UK, where we've still got a lot of capital going around, but nowhere is like the United States. So there's timing, there's context, and it's a success bias. And that message of, look, you've just got to keep doing it. It's nobody ever said entrepreneurship was easy. I don't remember anybody just saying that, right? So you just got to keep going and you will get there eventually if the product's right, if the market's right. Really good messages. And then talking about your team. So hold on. So you're a founder. You're looking for these other skills. You're looking for these networks, people that can do different things from you. So who is in your team now, and how many did you start with? And how have you thought through who you need to join?
Yeah, so we started with two, obviously me and my co-founder. I think a co-founder is imperative, but beyond that, we're now a team of five. And so we started, as I said, we started as a co-founder because our company is split down the middle essentially. So it's, business side, and technical side. And I think that's really important because you don't want to be in a situation where you have lots of overlapping tasks with your co-founder, because I feel like it can mean that, it's not as efficient, you're not as time efficient. Whereas what I think is really strong is if you have, co-founders with really defined roles, because, as you said, entrepreneurship's hard. I can only imagine how hard it is being a solo founder, solo deep tech founder, and even a solo life science founder, where you have to develop the product and then also do all of the business administration stuff. And so that's the first thing I would say is that, you need to be able to have that kind of divide in the company where there's someone that, oversees and owns technology and there's someone that owns the business side of things. And then, as you say, it's all about identifying the skills gap in the business. So, as me and Ian, we're biotechnologists by trade. We're not clinicians. And so we don't have the clinical, the skill set to design clinical trials and get regulatory approval. And so that's where you utilize either hiring consultants, which are really useful. Because you can fill that skills gap without having to pay a full-time salary. But also on the business side of things, like connections and like we recently onboarded our chair, and they're super useful because again, they provide a completely different skill set. Being able to open doors, having that experience raising Series A's, B's, having exits, that sort of thing is stuff that you need because as I say, you need to hire better and you need to be able to fill where there are gaps in your team. You much rather just hire slow, fire fast, and essentially you take your time, make sure they're the right person. Because if you're churning through all of these employees, it's going to cost you a load of money, and you're not going to be able to, rebuild anything. And for morale as well, it can only end badly if that's what happens. And so that's how we kind of went about our strategy, was just simply identifying what needs to be done and where's the skills gaps. Then looking at, can we use consultants to fill those? If we can't use consultants, can we use full-time employees? Or even interns. The final thing I'd mention on that is I think the level of experience as well. So there's some roles that I would say that you'd need a lot of experience in, like I would say the clinical trial and clinical operations manager. You'd want someone who's got a level of experience because they know what to expect. Whereas someone who's, a preclinical scientist who's doing testings and who's doing innovative things on the manufacturing side, we would want, I'm completely fine with hiring straight out of the university there because you want that youthful energy and that thinking outside of the box. And I think that's important as well.
How did you end up finding your co-founder? A lot of people struggle with this and they often don't start. They start on their own. And as you've said, that's extremely hard. And then have to go looking for it. But it sounded like you started off with Ian, what was his full name? Give him a shout out.
Ian Barsonev, yeah.
Oh, there you go. Good man. So hello, Ian. And how did you find each other? How did that work?
Yeah, well, it's actually a funny story, to be honest. So of course it was in first year. We both studied biotechnology of enterprise, and There was obviously a cohort group chat, and we just went out for drinks at Turtle Bay and for bottomless brunch at 10 a.m. in Turtle Bay, and that was where I first met him. And instantly, we were both from the same wavelength. We both wanted to start businesses, and so the conversation just naturally kind of gauged towards that. And that's when we started talking about all these different business ideas. And it was after that we then had a couple follow-up calls, and then we kind of just agreed to let's just see where it takes us. Let's write the business plan. Let's see what happens. And then we kind of wrote the business plan, and then we realized, okay, there's something good here. Obviously, me and him have a good working relationship. We're friends, and so that's how we've had. As I said, the company wouldn't be here if I didn't have a co-founder. And we're grateful to Turtle Bay for connecting us. But that is how we met.
There'll be a little plaque on Turtle Bay at some point in the next 20 years celebrating M&X. Around London, you get the little blue plaques to everybody, right? That's where yours is going to be. We haven't talked about the market yet. So we've talked a lot about the technology, about the regulation, about the people. And you did talk about getting validation from the market from people that you know. Outside of people that you know, outside of the technological investigations, who was the first person that you pitched the idea to, you spoke to about it? And what was their reaction? What did you learn from that conversation?
First of all, what we had to understand with our market was, first of all, who's our customer? Because this is a really key point, especially in health tech. You have so many different buyers. Your product is ultimately going to be used by an end user, but they're not going to be your ultimate customer. So speaking to them, may be good. But it's not really going to give you that many insight. Is it going to be your clinician? Well, yes and no. They're going to be using the product, but they're not actually going to be the ones purchasing it. Is it going to be the pharmaceutical companies? And so what we realized, it was the pharmaceutical companies. And I remember that our first call was with someone from GSK. And again, we pitched ideas to them. And as microneedle has been around for 5 decades. And so it wasn't new to them. And so when they were giving us all of this feedback, it was just super, super, super useful. And what we essentially enabled us to do was then create just this sheet with all of the different technical KPIs that they're looking for. So what are they looking for in this product? And why are they looking for this? And why has no one done it before? And it was from there when we realized, okay, what we got to do. And a lot of their KPIs already aligned with our KPIs that we had. And so that really did give us confidence that we were on the right track. And then I think, just speaking to more and more people, and finding the right person to speak to, I think, is just imperative. Because I remember, so in our business, we either license it to pharmaceutical companies, or we in-license their drug, or we in-license it and we sell it to the NHS. But who purchased vaccines in the NHS? The procurement directors? It's not them. So we spoke to them, realized it wasn't them. There's a Department of Health and Social Care, so we spoke to them and realized it wasn't them. Then we finally were put in touch with the UK Health Security Agency, who are the ones who purchased the vaccines. And that conversation was just so insightful, because again, there was that validation of the product and how it has great potential and, it can save lives, can, increase biosecurity, stockpiling, all of that sort of stuff. But I think what was even more interesting was some of the key insights that we got with regards to what they're looking for in a supplier. Because what they were saying is that many companies go to them and try and sell to centrally, but what they don't understand is that if they're pulling in a 10 million pound order, then they expect that to be 10 million every year. You have to be able to demonstrate supply chain resilience. You have to be able to demonstrate that that you can manufacture at the scale that they need. And it was actually through them where it pointed us to a different market niche, because they were like, look, just honestly, as a startup with your first product, it's not feasible to think that you're going to be able to sell hundreds of millions of doses to the NHS. And it's going to be really hard for us to put faith in you that you can do that. But if you go for, a smaller, more niche market, demonstrate that there's that you can manufacture, that you can sell there, then that opens up the door. And that was essentially the same as what we heard from the pharmaceutical companies as well, was that, look, just show us that you can make a product, you can take it to market, and then once you do that, we'll happily license it. And that was only gained through making sure that we spoke to the market, but not just our customers, but the end users, the key stakeholders, and then the pharmaceutical players. Because if we didn't do that, then, you know, we would have gone down a completely, a rabbit hole essentially, and we would have made some of the mistakes that our competitors made as well.
Interesting. So first you've got to find who the customer is. You might think you know it is, but then you've got to talk to them, and you'll probably find that it isn't. It's somebody else. You've got to get the support of all those stakeholders and understand what they need across that value chain, but you've got to find that customer. Really interesting what you were just saying about the NHS. A lot of people who are in biotech, health tech in the UK have a natural first inclination to say NHS, because that's what we have. It's the one big monolithic provider of almost all healthcare services in the UK, which is unusual in the world. It's not normal. We love it, but it's not normal. So what would you say to other health tech and biotech startups? Do they go for the NHS? Do they look for a niche somewhere else? What would you say would be the approach to take?
What you say is true in that initially everyone thinks that the NHS is a huge market, and then you get these super experienced guys or people who come in and say, no, don't sell to the NHS, because what they've seen is they've seen hundreds of companies die on the hill trying to sell into the NHS, because the NHS, as you say, it's huge, it's monolithic, it's old, and it's really, compartmentalized and segmented. And so do you actually sell into that? Trying to find the right person is a nightmare. And what you would see is companies that would develop amazing technologies, from the great research base that we have in the UK, world-leading research bases, and then just go over to the US and to the FDA, or just go to the EU. And the reason for that is because the NHS is really seen as a really hard organization to sell into. And what I think is, or what the government is trying to do, along with the MHRA, is making sure that there is this coherent pathway where people can, companies with novel innovations, can actually get their products to market, and can sell into the NHS. Because as you said, we're very privileged in the sense that we have one organization that pretty much handles the bulk of healthcare in the UK. And so you would have thought being in the UK becomes some sort of competitive advantage, because UK companies could then sell to this huge buyer. And that just hasn't been the case in recent years. But I think there is a trend where that is slowly becoming norm. And I think one of the ways in which we're looking to approach that is by developing the product in conjunction with the NHS, so as a collaboration with the NHS. And so we're doing all of our clinical trials with the NHS, and making sure that we have NHS clinicians on our clinical advisory board, making sure that we are building relationships with the NHS, so that at the time, when we can start selling the product, we have that option to sell to the NHS.
So there's all sorts of stuff around which bit of the NHS is not just one thing. Having those relationships structured and institutionalized. You've got people on your board, for example, who've got working with different parts of the NHS in order to become almost, it's almost like you're becoming part of the organism.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
You're sticking yourself on the outside of it and slowly melding in. Interesting. I want to move now to lessons you've learned, things that you've found out, what you can tell people. There's so much come out already in this. First one, looking back at that entire process you've just been through, what would be a decision that maybe you would go back and change if you could?
I would probably say, speaking to customers as early on as possible is key, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be purchasing your product. And so you need to be able to have this response with them. And I think one thing that I was also worried about, which kind of prevented me from reaching out earlier, was the idea that I was scared that they would say that the product wasn't what they'd want. And so for me, it's like, if they don't want the product, then all of a sudden this business just capitulates because there's no product that we can sell. But that's just normal. Like, you have to understand that the first iteration of a product you have, they're going to have comments about it. They're going to say, like, this is good, this is nice, but this isn't. And it's all about that process and that's how you iterate, as you would with customer feedback and, market research. It's the exact same thing. But I think when you're selling B2B, I think it's just, startups don't do it as early as they should, I think. And common advice that I've always received is that it's never really too early to have those sort of conversations. I remember I was at an accelerator program, and they were saying how they managed to get a first sale with Pfizer just off a PDF of saying what they would create, and they managed to generate a first sale. And so I think that goes to show that, it's never too early to have these sort of conversations, and that ultimately, if you don't have those conversations, then how are you going to know what they want?
Customer, customer, customer. And if it doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for anybody, right? The technicals don't matter.
Exactly.
The regulation doesn't matter if people don't want it. Yeah, completely agree. What about anything that might be slightly counterintuitive or surprising that you've learned coming through the process? Something that's not in the standard playbook, not something that you don't read on a blog normally, or you don't read in something from Strategizer, let's say.
I always remember the professor who told me this: if you think that you're not doing enough, you probably are. And if you think that you're doing enough, you probably aren't. And I think that also feeds into burnout as well, because I think burnout can occur when it feels like you're working, but there's no real results at the end. Because I feel like burnout doesn't occur when you get great success and you're working, long hours and you're getting success, because it inherently motivates you. But it's when like you're working and there's no success, and then all of a sudden you can think to yourself, like, am I doing enough? Am I doing, all of this sort of thing? And you can start to burn out. And I always remind myself that, as I said to that saying, if you think that you're not doing enough, then you probably are. And if you do think that you are doing enough, then you're probably not. So I always like to make sure that I'm always, thinking that I'm not doing enough, so that I do enough.
Nice. Well, but you raised a really, really important point as well, though. It's entrepreneurs have to do crazy amounts of work to make it work. They're laying the road in front of them. And you said something about, what if you feel like you're not succeeding? Which puts me in mind, how are you defining success as you go along? What is it that makes you feel like you're succeeding? Given it's the very long road, as you said, I'm doing something that's a medical device, that's something that's about medical manufacturing. That's going to take years to get out of the world, and you know that. So how are you then keeping yourself going on that? How does it feel successful? What do you keep doing?
Yeah, the key thing is being able to define what the key internal KPIs of your business are. How do you track progress? And so on the manufacturing side, that's all about, testing and designing and speed of manufacturing, cost of goods, that sort of thing. And obviously, as I said, you just look at that and how does it compare with, with the KPI list that you have. And that obviously is really inherently motivational from the technical side. But then on the business side, getting in those meetings with pharmaceutical companies, raising that money, perhaps, filing the IP, that sort of thing. Because I think you have to take the wins, because they're few and far between most of the time. It's a long road. You're getting rejected left, right, center. And so where there might not be conventional success in the sense that you're generating millions of pounds or you've raised tens of millions, you have to be able to look at the little wins, because ultimately that's what helps you push you on. Because burnout occurs when it feels like you're putting in so much effort, but without that reward. Being able to identify those wins, I think, are really important, just to keep you in the right mindset to keep on going. Because as you said, it's a long, tough road, and you've got to be able to stick at it.
Yeah, celebrating the wins, take the little wins as you go along the road. It's really, really good advice.
Yeah, and another thing that I'd say as well is looking back. So over like the 6 months, maybe on a day-to-day basis, it seems like you're not doing anything. But then actually, if you take, you go from month 6 and you look back to month 1, you're like, oh wow, look at the progress I've made. And I think that's really inspirational for yourself and really self-motivating, because it shows that although on the day-to-day you're not making that much progress, when you actually take a more holistic, high-level view, you are making a lot of progress. And I think that's incredibly motivating.
Yeah, I think that's right. So given that you're been going through this, is there a book or a tool or a paper or a process, is something that you say, look, that was really useful for me, even indispensable, that you would recommend to somebody else, another founder?
What has really been invaluable for us is mentoring and mentorship. I'm someone that's been in that. I really cannot understate, how important it is for you as a founder, because it can be a lonely journey. It's very tough. For instance, you're working on this task, you have a timeline, it overruns by like 3 months or whatever. And you're sitting there feeling really bad because it almost feels you haven't hit your goals. And then you speak to someone who's had, 20 years in the industry, and they're like, it's not, everything's always delayed. And it's super, super useful, because it makes you feel like, yes, okay, you're still doing the right thing, you're on the right track, and beyond that, connections, network, just invaluable. There's so many people that are willing to give other people advice as well, because they've had the same advice given to them when they were younger. And so, yeah, I would say that's probably the main thing. If they're to anyone starting a company, just make sure you find someone who's been there, done that, that you can just speak to about your company.
And so many people are actually up for doing that, aren't they? And there's so many people that will enjoy mentoring, do mentoring. It's a win-win as a process, I think.
No, definitely. And my chair recently said to me, one of the reasons I help out with early stage companies and I take these roles is because someone did it for me. And it's just so true, you just give them back to the community, because you realize that when you're in the dire position, or in the, precarious position, you had that same in and helped you.
Fantastic. Moving on now, thinking about the future for a second. Talk about mentoring and then talk about that advice that you would give somebody to think about the small successes along the way. Sounds to me like you've developed a real, not just a practical understanding of how entrepreneurship works and the practical issues there, but also there is a very, very important piece about an entrepreneurial resilience that has an emotional overlay, whether it be how you structure your company, how you structure your KPIs, how you use your mentor. It sounds to me like there's an emotional journey you've been going through as well.
Yeah, definitely. As everyone knows, entrepreneurship's there's no easy feat. And so it's going to be an uphill battle from day dot, really. And so you have to be able to be pragmatic about it. If you get really intense about the emotion, then you can just, burn out and spiral. And so having someone there and done that and being able to be the sounding board is someone who's, way more experienced is just super important, because they've been there, they've done that. If you have a challenge, it puts everything into perspective, really, because you can see that they've achieved what they've achieved and that they've gone through a similar experience to you. And I think it's something that's not really talked about, how kind of rough it can be in the earlier stage. But even a simple, listen to a podcast where you have a super successful entrepreneur say how challenging it was early on, it just makes you feel that you're on the right. It is, especially with fundraising, it is emotional. It can be soul destroying at times. And so you have to be able to be pragmatic and detach yourself from the emotion, create a strategy and develop a plan, a financial business plan that is coherent, that you can get people behind, and ultimately then just stick to it. And if the plan's good enough, you're gonna achieve success. I think the main thing is a burnout piece. And if you don't have that support, then you can very easily burn out. And burnout is really the enemy of success, because you have to be consistent, and that's what burnout means. The quality of work is decreasing, and therefore you lose that consistency streak.
Really important. So most important thing to do as you go is protect yourself, protect your resilience.
Exactly. I'm naturally a sporty guy, so running, going to the clearing the head, making sure you have hobbies outside of the business so that you can switch off and unwind.
Switch around. Think about the road ahead for a second. What's the most exciting milestone for microneedle solutions in the next year? What's going to happen?
Yeah, well, the most exciting one is our clinical trial. The reason why this is super exciting for us is because it's a massive value inflection point. So we go from being a preclinical stage to a clinical stage company. It opens up the door to later stage investors, larger investors, and people start to listen. Because ultimately, if there's one thing demonstrating your product in animal models, but if you're demonstrating on humans to work, then that's huge for us. And so we're really excited about it because it's in collaboration with the NHS. It's collaboration with the Leeds NHS Teaching Trust, which is one of the biggest in the country. It really does kick off the business, to the next stage of growth, which is then after that and our efficacy and then ultimately approval. And luckily, thanks to the UK, we had it funded by Innovate UK.
Yeah, that's a massive one. As you say, it switches the value of the business hugely. Makes you so much more investable at so much better rate as well. So much.
Exactly.
Great.
Yeah, because as you were saying about de-risking, from an early stage deep tech, it's all about de-risking. That's how your value increases. And so if you're able to demonstrate efficacy and safety in a human model, which is ultimately what the products can be used for, your value, 10x's. And so you can raise a lot more at a lot more expensive money as well.
So for the investors, for the potential partners, even future employees that are listening right now, What is your biggest challenge? What are the ways where our audience can help you with that?
I'd say our biggest challenge, and I think it's the biggest challenge of every startup, is just funding. We joke around that if we had enough money, we could get this product to market in a year. But there is just the funding gap. The funding gap is it's not that we're something that we're particularly struggling with at the moment. You've got to bake in 9 months to your development timelines to raise that funding, especially in this current climate.
Well, funding, ladies and gentlemen. So if you want to find for your investment funds, for your LPs, a young, growing, British, high-tech, deep tech, already successful company to invest in, you could do a lot worse than having a conversation with Henry Dunne. Henry, where can our listeners go to follow your journey and learn out more about M&S?
So they can go to our website at www.microneedlesolutions.com, or alternatively go to our LinkedIn, which is just M&S, just the letters M and S. And if failing that, you can always follow me on LinkedIn, where I'll be posting regular updates as to.
And if they want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Just reach me on my email, which is henry.dunne@microneedlesolutions.com.
henry.dunne@microneedlesolutions.com. Henry, fantastic. Thank you so much for coming along. It's been a fascinating interview. There's so much in there that can help different founders just to start to navigate a little bit differently, a little bit more successfully the way ahead. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, Neil. And it was a fantastic opportunity to get our story out, but also catch up with you.
Lovely. Nice one, Henry. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Henry Dunne.